Spring is when I prefer to crawl out of hibernation. I prefer to starving to death, at least, since I'd much rather stay holed up in my study all year. I'd like nothing more than to keep reading the tomes that line the walls of my tower until my eyes would melt like candles, and I would have to learn how to read by smell. But men, even geniuses beyond the ken of common men, need to eat. And to eat I need gold, and unless everything has changed since the last time I left my study, it takes work to get gold. My preferred method of operation is to make as much gold as quickly as possible, which is typically through some risky endeavor involving a group of assorted specialists seeking some item or villain or kidnap something or other. The specifics rarely matter. At this stage in my life, I have grown well past the notion of asking the why of mundane matters, since they always follow the simple and constant pattern of logic. I believe it's best to be as direct as possible about indirect things, and I should say this clearly. I am not fond of logic. Logic may be the greatest triumph of the rational mind, but upon stepping beyond those boundaries, it is a useless tether that inhibits nearly everything I try to do. Logic is the nagging mother who pulls you down to the ground when you try to fly, the miserable teacher who denies your answer since it's not the same as the one in his book. As a wizard, I dedicate myself to the strict principle of completely snubbing logic. I found myself in a tavern, though I'm rather certain that's not where I was trying to go. The calibration of my teleportation crystals must have either been misaligned, or they simply were not in the mood, and I jotted down a quick note to either realign them or scold them when I returned to my tower. Though it was not my intended destination, it turned out to be a suitable place to find an odd assortment of mixed company who were seeking some ancient secret or recent rumor or whatever it is that those kinds of groups are currently concerned with. The path that magic lays out for me is strange indeed, since in only a few seconds I noticed just such a group huddled in the darkest corner of the tavern, and with a sudden blast of hindsight, quickly scratched out a rather unnecessary addition to my notebook. A blonde-haired human wearing a silver-inlaid armor was lazily arguing with a black-bearded dwarf with eyebrows so thick and long they completely obscured his eyes. Across from them sat an auburn-haired elf with a bored expression, in circles upon a map with her finger, and all of them seemed to share the aura of people waiting for something to happen. Digging into my pockets, I found my cure stone, a large amethyst cut in the shape of a spindle. It remained motionless, and so did I, until the volume of the two men's arguments rose sharply and the gemstone began to vibrate. "I say we don't need one," the dwarf suddenly bellowed. "They're ill luck and I could never stand their antics." "We don't have a choice," the human said, equally loudly, but far more calmly. "We don't stand a chance without a Wizard?" I asked, stepping towards them, making sure my pointed hat and robes were excessively visible. "I couldn't help but overhear—" "I bet you could," the dwarf began. "Could, yes, but I ended up overhearing anyways," I continued, "and I just happened to be looking for work befitting my profession." The three of them eyed me over for a few seconds, and while they did, I had a sudden epiphany. With my skills and incredible intelligence, it made little sense for me to go risking my life following a group of strangers into some unknown dangerous locale for the sake of treasure that may or may not even be there. I could simply summon an earth elemental and ask it to deliver me some gold, and it would locate a natural vein of the material and dig it up all by itself in no time at all. Just as I was about to turn away and begin my profitable new venture, the human spoke up. "It's good that you offered your help, for we are in great need of a wizard. You see, 1,000 years ago, I would have cut him short at that point, but politeness demanded that I listen to the full story of all of his ancestors and why it's his destiny to get the something or other. While the man recounted the last several hundred years to a person who likely wrote the book he was reading from, I took a moment to take a close examination of the three of them. The human was clearly a warrior, judging by his build and sense of awareness, though his unmarred equipment and light attitude led me to believe he lacked actual combat experience and instead relied on sparring matches to satisfy his ego. He had the good sort of pride, the kind that kept you on the straight and narrow path and made you bathe often, though you couldn't have had the good kind without the bad kind. He seemed completely convinced that he was the only one who could retrieve the ancient lost thing, and I could only hope he wouldn't get himself needlessly killed. It took me a moment, but the way his nostrils twitched and slightly in a very peculiar way whenever he took a deep breath, convinced me that his name was Latacius Delallor. It takes a special kind of genius to be able to learn a person's name from such subtle clues, but you can't become a wizard if you can't handle such simple deductions. The dwarf was a dwarf, stubborn, enjoys ale, and decidedly attached to his beard. While this may seem like something that just about any man who knows anything about dwarves could discern from a casual glance at once, that's actually a rather bigoted idea, and you should be a little ashamed for thinking that. I assure you that I noticed many fine details that permitted me to be certain that he was a stereotypical dwarf, such as the ale tankard in his hand and the beard on his face. Of course, thanks to my thorough academic instruction, I could read the dwarven runes that he had chiseled onto his armor, and discern that his name was Made in Ironhall. The elf was attractive, but the distinct calluses on her fingers led me to believe that she was well practiced in picking locks and pockets, or that she enjoyed tickling armadillos under their chins, which would develop similar calluses. Either way, she was not a woman I could easily trust, but thankfully my drink arrived halfway through the human's tale, and it became that much easier. By watching at what parts of Latacius's story her ears perked up, I realized that she was his childhood friend, and that both of them harbored hidden feelings for each other. Likely, by the end of this adventure, they will have shared a few romantic scenes and realized that they had loved each other since the moment they had first met. Unfortunately, that means I would have to come up with excuses to leave the two of them alone for lengths of time, which meant I would have to drag the dwarf off and spend time with him. Hopefully, the dwarf enjoys being regaled by lengthy, historically rich, while highly relevant stories, as I would be sure to provide him with these. I'm sick of these lengthy, historically rich, while highly relevant story. Maiden interrupted just as Latacius was in the middle of explaining how his evil half-brother had stolen some artifact that's prevented some ancient evil from doing something. Yeah, we should go out and do something already, the elf added. There was a moment where everyone simply stared at each other until my cue stone began to vibrate. Yes, we should definitely go now, as there is no time to waste, I said, moving towards the door. Where exactly should we go? Latacius asked, and he sounded genuinely curious. Well, if your half-brother is clearly evil, then he'll likely be in a clearly evil place. There is a place called Castration Mountain not too far from here, and that's likely the most evil-sounding place for miles. If he's anything like me, he'd stay far away from a place called Castration Mountain, Maiden growled, and while I agreed that it wasn't a place any sane man would want to venture towards, I had to figure out some way to convince him to go. "It's a misnomer," I said simply. "Its name originally came from the old goblin words Casterchen, which means wide mountain. The name changed over the centuries until it became known as Castration Mountain." "I see," Maiden interrupted, "but that's still no reason to think that's his brother." "Half-brother?" Latacius interjected. "We'll go near the place. It's a fool's errand to go there without some sort of proof that he's beyond your silly line of reasoning." "I saw that he was there through my crystal ball," I invented quickly, "so we might as well be going." It took us nearly 3 days to reach Castration Mountain, and during the trip I spent a good portion of my time explaining the deep mysteries of magic to Maiden, while Latacius and the elf would keep doing that glance at each other, then quickly look away while blushing act. It wasn't until we reached the mountain itself that Maiden explained that he had a remarkable talent, that of being able to sleep while walking, something I hadn't noticed before thanks to his obscenely bushy brows. The elf, I swear I'll figure out her name eventually, managed to spy a group of goblins from a good distance away, and my compatriots eagerly readied themselves for a battle. Though I'd rather not dampen their spirits so early into our quest, I was also not in the mood for them to discover what the goblins of Castration Mountain did to any men that they managed to capture. With a few quick words, I created the illusion of a large boulder, telling them that we could simply hide inside of it until the goblins passed. The dwarf and elf grumbled at the motion of hiding from goblins, but Latacius seemed to think it was a genuinely good idea. "And if they do discover us," he added, "we'll just leap out and kill them all." Hiding inside the illusion of the boulder, we watched as the group of goblins swelled in size as it came nearer and nearer, until we were all rather glad that we had chosen to hide. There must have been hundreds of them, along with hobgoblins, ogres, and trolls, all of them well armed and moving with purpose. There are frightening things in this world, but few of them compare to a small army of monsters headed towards you, chatting in loud voices about how they were going to castrate any man they found. "I thought you said it was a misnomer," Maiden dared to whisper as the goblin, less than 10 paces away from us, began to cackle as it sharpened its knives. "I lied. Casterchen actually means to remove the testes in Goblin." "You bastard!" Though the rest of the group was rather unhappy about being at an incredibly high risk of being found and subsequently slaughtered, I was rather pleased because there was no way these creatures managed to organize themselves in such a large group without some sort of incredibly powerful person acting as their leader. By listening to the goblins and the other monsters chatter away, I quickly discovered that not only were they being led by Latacius's half-brother, an obvious conclusion, but that if there was an elf hiding from them at that exact moment, her name would likely be Belandra Greenleaf. After nearly half an hour, the army of monsters passed us without even going near our illusory boulder, much to the relief of my party. Belandra seemed to be ready to go, but both Latacius and Maiden required a few minutes to regain their composure. Though they were both hardy men, there's only so many times that a man could listen to an army of monsters threatening to geld them before they break down. That number is 637, and they each heard that threat well over 1,000 times. With the army out of the way, we made our way towards the massive keep where Latacius's half-brother was holding the something. In truth, I'm pretty sure I could just summon an earth elemental, have him infiltrate the castle by tunneling through the walls, steal the something and return within a matter of minutes. But it was fairly obvious that we'd all have to go into the castle, fight a number of battles against groups of monsters that were appropriately sized for us to triumph over them, and then we'd finally meet the half-brother, listen to his speech, and after a thrilling battle where the dwarf would sacrifice his life, we would succeed in retrieving the whatever it is. Now, I felt pretty sorry for Maiden. I'm not the person who decided to be completely expendable. Once inside the castle, Belandra began to sneaking about, picking various locks and opening various chests and drawers. We followed immediately after her, armor clanking, as the two other men strode through the stone corridors, wondering what she could possibly have been hidden in a pantry. There were a few battles, but I didn't even need to participate in them, allowing me to write up a first draft of Maiden's eulogy as the three of them fought. Every so often I would create the illusion of flames and send them towards a goblin just to pretend I was being productive, in case there later was a dispute as to how much gold I was supposed to get at the end of this adventure. After a few hours, we had cleared the outer area of the keep, with the dwarf and elf grabbing anything valuable that wasn't bolted down, but still hadn't figured out how to get into the inner part of the castle. Thankfully, just as the party was about to lose hope, my Q-stone began to vibrate when I was next to a very large expanse of wall. Unsure of what it meant at first, I simply paused, dramatically pulling out my notebook and began drawing various scribbles to stall for time. "What is it?" Lutatius asked, looking excited. "There is a strange flow of energy. I am trying to analyze where it's coming from," I replied as I drew a picture of a cute rabbit.
"Wait a moment. This part of the wall seems different,"
Belandra said as she began to examine it.
"Yes, it's a secret passageway."
After pushing and pulling several stones a few times, she managed to figure out how to open the passage. As the stones slid to either side, Lutatius turned towards Maiden and said, "See, I told you it was a good idea to bring a wizard with us. We might never have found the secret passage without him." "Humph," was all that Maiden replied as he stepped into the dark passageway. "I would have noticed it eventually." After fighting our way through the inner keep, we finally reached the massive chamber where Lutatius's half-brother was using this sort of potato-looking object in some kind of ritual. Though I was pretty tired from having to pretend to be productive for so long, I listened as the half-brother began his speech with, 1,000 years ago my ancestors began..." Somewhere around halfway through his speech, I realized that his entire motivation for performing the ritual was because one of his ancestors was cruelly betrayed by his king, and now he sought revenge against the entire kingdom. While it was true that his ancestor had been betrayed, I suddenly realized a way for us to completely skip the tragic battle in which Maiden would heroically sacrifice himself. "You're wrong," I said to him. "King Andaleros would not have betrayed Nadarin Delaor in the Battle of Naglfandelish because the two of them lived nearly 100 years apart, and Nadarin Delaor hadn't even been born when the battle began." Lutatius and his half-brother stared at me, but I simply put my hand into one of the large pockets within my robe, and I pulled out my notebook as I cast a minor illusion upon it. I even have proof. The chronicler, Bargladunjabushabudabu, has all the dates right here in his History of the Kingdom. In fact, it says that Nadarin Delaor lived a very long time and was good friends with all the kings that reigned during his happy life. The half-brother couldn't believe it. and even continued to deny it after he had read the passages I pointed out to him in my glamoured book. So I put my notebook back into my pocket, cast another quick illusion, and brought out another book that told the same story. After 4 times, the half-brother no longer knew what to believe. Finally, he simply broke down, crying about how he had wasted his whole life believing in a story that had been completely untrue. With tears in his eyes, he thanked me for stopping him from doing something that he would have greatly regretted, and then embraced Lutatius like a brother, swearing never to do anything so foolish ever again. Just as we were about to leave, my keel stone began to vibrate once again, except that it had never vibrated so hard before. My brain quickly tried to figure out what it meant, but without any real ideas of what it could mean, I simply said the first thing that came to my head. "I don't think it's over," I said, turning around to face the center of the chamber where Bellandra stood, holding the potato-like thingamabob.
"You fools! It is I who will summon the Dark Lord to destroy the kingdom,"
she shouted, holding the frumpy object above her head. "Really?" I asked, sighing. I guess I should have expected something like this, because it's usually what happens whenever I narrate my own thoughts and spoil the ending to my adventures prematurely. These kinds of unlikely twists tend to crop up whenever I do that, but at least I wasn't going to be too much of a setback. To summarize what happened afterwards, she summoned the Dark Lord, we fought it, Lutatius professed his love for Bellandra, Maiden ended up surviving because Lutatius's half-brother ended up sacrificing himself to save us all, and Bellandra surprised everyone by dealing the killing blow against the Dark Lord. It was all very exciting. Afterwards, we headed back towards the city, only to run into several bands of goblins. Since everyone was terribly wounded from the last exciting battle, except for me, because I had stayed in the back during the fight, but I had cast a few quick illusions on myself to make it look like I had suffered grievous wounds, just so they wouldn't think I hadn't taken my share of the beating, we simply hid inside of my boulder illusions each time. We made it back to the tavern where everything had started, and Lutatius thought that would be a good time to propose to Bellandra. It was in fact a terrible time because I wanted to get back to my study, but we still hadn't discussed exactly how much I was going to be paid. While I was waiting for everyone to finish celebrating, Maiden clapped me on the shoulder, his beard covered in beer foam, and grinning like only a drunk dwarf can. Seeing an opportunity, I decided to discuss my pay with him, and after some quick negotiating I had a quarter of the castle's treasure safely stored inside the pockets of my robe, though the dwarf also offered one of his daughters for a wife, which I had to decline on account of the irrefutable logic that all of his daughters likely had brows just as bushy as his. Then, just before I was about to leave, I realized that something was missing. I waited and waited until my keystone finally began to vibrate. Lutatius was just finishing his retelling of our story of our adventures to the Pack Tavern, and his eyes were tearing up as he described his half-brother's noble sacrifice. Quickly whipping out my notebook, I turned to the page where I had written the speech in case Maiden had died. After a few quick edits, I committed the whole thing to memory and stepped forward, a tankard in my hand. When I finished delivering my eulogy, the tavern was filled with weeping men and women, touched by a speech I had mostly plagiarized and filled with generic stock phrases. Lutatius thanked me for the kind words for his half-brother, while Bellandra and Maiden shook my hand in turn. The vibrations coming from my pocket began again, and I knew it was time to go. With a quick nod, a smile, and a small spin, I teleported away with a flash of light, and I landed in a swamp likely miles away from my tower.